welcome to Classical Schmassical, the anti-classical classical music podcast. Tune in every Saturday, or roughly every Saturday, as we discuss, deconstruct, and dissect what it means to be a musician in the modern world. I'm your host, Alexa Letourneau. I use any pronouns you like, and our guest this week is Seamus Flynn.
Hello, friends. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Seamus Hubbard Flynn. I use they, them pronouns, or maybe any pronouns. The gender is a work in progress. Gender
I get
beta.
that.
Yeah, that's me. I play the flute. I compose.
Yeah, it's super exciting. You're the first flutist that I've had on the show, and I'm like, yeah, Flutist-Composers.
You're the first flutist you've had on this show.
Okay, to be fair, you're the first guest flutist that I've had on the show. You know what I mean. But I love our conversations off air, and I said, oh, we should come and talk about flute and composing and all sorts of things. And so I'm really, really excited that you're here. Just to start out, because it's my stock instrumentalist or performer question. What are some things that you find in your experience people get wrong about flute? Because I know I certainly have opinions on the way different composers write.
I would love to hear your opinion, since I know you've been a flutist longer than me. I've definitely gotten the vibe in the few situations where I've worked with composers and conductors as the person who knows more about flute than them, as opposed to being in an environment of flutists where I'm the noob, which has been, I think, generally more of my experience with flute has been the latter. But in situations where I have to be more of an authority on flute, I find that people don't realize that flute can play high. Flute can comfortably go to what is it, C7, the C that's an octave above the C above the treble clef staff, and that is a note that flute can play. I mean, for me it's for me it's B is the top of the thing that I'm really comfortable with, because because it's only been several years that I've been a flutist, as opposed to doing it from being a wee child. But still, just that whole third octave, don't be afraid of that.
Yeah, it's not difficult to maneuver around in, and also please don't rate it in 8VA. We just read ledger lines
that too. Oh my God,
I hate it.
Flutists know how to read tons of ledger lines, so Don't do octava. Don't do octava.
I had an orchestration class once where they said anytime you go above an F or a G to put it in octava, and I was like, no, never do that. Never do that. Because I will read up to an octave above that just on site, and it's so annoying. I had one piece once where it was it was a full running line, but anytime they would reach high C, they would put it in 8VA, so it looked like it was jumping down. Ooh, it just that drives me up a wall.
Yeah, so I'm glad we have some commonality there.
Yeah, definitely. Oh my gosh, and I don't know. I feel even when we go up high, people use it sort of as a textural effect, which doesn't necessarily have to be that. Bird imitations are something that everyone's oh, it's so cute and fluty, but I don't know. I get annoyed when I'm just flitting around versus we can do some hefty melody stuff up there.
Yeah, I guess also, and I think this is sometimes a misconception among flutists too, because we're oh, the bottom few notes of the flute, it's really hard to project. So some flutists will get I don't know, get upset with composers for writing for those things, but it's well, if you really drill it, that can sound really good.
Yeah.
So also don't shy away from that. Use the flute's whole range.
Yeah, you've got this whole range. It's I don't know. I was told by a teacher once that it was weird because my low range is really big and boomy, and I was just yeah, it's because I like playing down there. I've practiced it. It's nice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that one thing that isn't utilized a ton, I feel and this is in very I'm fairly limited experience too, being a composer primarily, as I just don't see a ton of extended techniques being used, or people will stick to generally like air sounds, key clicks, and that's sort of that's the extent to what I see in sort of the like mainstream contemporary flute repertoire. So I'm curious as to what are some of your favorite extended techniques to play, to write, what, like, how do you utilize these extra timbres?
Yeah, so having listened to some of your other episodes, I always wonder if like starting with the extended techniques question is like bait or a deterrent for your audiences.
That's fair.
And I guess maybe it's a bit of both. But yeah, it's interesting that you'd say, since I mean you're I guess you're more active in playing lots of new music than me. It's interesting that you'd say that there's like a few stock extended techniques on flute that people stick to, because I don't know, like the way that I think about flute and around like at least some of the composers who are writing for flute and performers who are commissioning for flute and improvisers who are improvising on flute, it's kind of more of an extended technique-y instrument than a lot of wind instruments, just because since you have your whole mouth still available to you and there isn't something shoved in your mouth, there's a lot of different things you can do simultaneously, different types of vocal sounds, singing in unison, although I'm personally really bad at that because I can't figure out how to make it not just like a v sound because your lips are so close together. But yeah, I mean, most of my extended technique experience is just from like improvising rather than from learning repertoire.
Okay.
And I can say that two things I've come up with that I'd be very interested to know if like, are these things that exist or did I just randomly make this up? I guess, excuse me, just ate recently. I guess just in general using the flute as an amplifier for other vocal noises you're doing. Like not even doing it simultaneously with any quote-unquote flute noises, but just covering the mouthpiece hole all the way. And then one thing you can do is slurping. And just slurp for a long period of time, and the flute like gives this bass amplification for your slurp, and it's really gross and janky, and I recommend it. Oh
wow, I definitely gonna have to try that.
The other thing is assuming the same position and singing, and then changing your fingerings, and I kid you not, the pitch of the note you're singing, you sustain one pitch, and you change your fingerings on flute, and you can change the pitch by up to like a whole step.
Oh wow, that's so
because
weird.
You're changing the length of the tube.
Yeah, I feel like that would mess with my head.
It's like a sort of robot effect, sort of vocoder effect. Like it sounds like singing, but like not quite because you're singing into this tube.
Oh, interesting.
So that's a wild thing also that I recommend. And then more, I guess, in the world of actual flute extended techniques that like lots of composers use. I love tongue pits.
See, I've never been able to get tongue pits to work for me. And like you were saying, you've been improvising a lot, and I'm not an improviser, and it's something that I definitely want to get better at. Or I'm not super comfortable improvising. I've done it a bit, but it's not something that's become a huge part of my musical practice. And so I feel like, I don't know, I feel sometimes limited by like what's on the page or even like the notation that we currently use, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying I have a ton of experience as an improviser either. Sure. Just that like my main experience with extended techniques is from improvising rather than from learning repertoire with lots of extended techniques in it.
Yeah.
But in the case of tongue pits, I forget whether it was like an in-person tutorial or an online tutorial or like what context it was that I had to learn it for first. But it was explained to me in a way that just seemed like, oh yeah, that's pretty simple. You put your tongue on your alveolar ridge, and then you thwack it downward while assuming the flutometer.
Yeah.
And then you do that into the flute. Doesn't work that well above like middle of the second octave.
Sure. My I don't know. I feel like my tongue doesn't move like that, but It's also
Okay.
I'm very curious.
Well,
to know.
I can't flutter tongue, so
Yeah.
all of our mouths are different.
I couldn't roll my R's at all until I studied abroad in Austria, where they like have the rolled R in the language, and then like one
Yeah.
day, 2 months into being there, I was like, oh, okay. And now it's one of my favorite extended techniques to do, because I couldn't do it for so long, and I worked so hard, and then when I wasn't even trying, it just clicked, and I don't know.
That's wonderful. I hope that happens to me with Spanish someday. That's been my
So, fingers
second
crossed.
language that I've been learning throughout school. And I was even in Spain for a few months, but then coronavirus happened. Maybe if it hadn't happened, I'd have gotten to the point of rolling my R's by the end of that. But oh well.
Well, hopefully, fingers crossed.
But yeah, tongue pits, and then head joint effects are really cool.
Okay, see, I also have not done too many of those. It's like, I did one, in high school I had one where it was like, stick your finger in the end and make it a slide whistle. But then I got taken off of that
really
solo,
cool.
and I was like, hey, I had fun doing that. Let me disassemble my instrument.
Who had that solo? What piece was this?
Oh, I'm not gonna remember the name of it. It was really cool. The piece started. It was sort of kind of South American inspired. I think it was by a South American composer.
Okay.
I don't remember exactly what region.
Okay.
But it started basically a whole page flute solo. But right before that, there was the solo of like the slide whistle effects.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was taken off of it because they wanted me to play like the traditional solo, and it was like I was having trouble getting my flute back in tune, putting it together over the course of like 2 measures, like right to the right point to then play the rest of the page.
Right.
So like I get it, but also I wanted to take apart my instrument because I thought it was fun.
Yeah. So a thing, I mean, again, head joint is something that, like, rather than being given it in pieces, it's just something that I've like figured out. And another thing that I've realized is, like, if you just take the foot joint and you hook it up to the head joint without the body, and then play, and then you hit the various spatula keys and trill keys on the foot joint, you can get a whole tone scale out of that. I'm not kidding. Yeah.
I need to be more adventurous with my instrument. That's so much fun. Oh, I love that. Wow. See, I'm going to have to like go and spend an hour or 2 improvising after this because I need to try out all these things. That sounds so cool.
A thing that Leah Stevens at Z-Fest introduced me to is that if you just take the head joint off and then hold the body and the foot joint, finger it this way like it was a clarinet,
and then buzz
your lips
it.
into it like it's a brass instrument.
It's so dumb. I love that.
I can only get it to speak on the few lowest notes, but it's
I've been playing around with that effect for probably a couple years now, and I'm up to almost a scale, and I'm like, woo, this is exciting. Because it's very interesting when you take apart a flute, play it like a trumpet, and it sounds sort of like a bad clarinet. Like, love it.
Learning brass the back doorway.
Yeah. So with all of these sort of techniques, how does your performance, either of just extended techniques or regular, how does your performance impact your work as a composer, and vice versa? How do these two things like interact in your musical practice?
So when I got the episode outline a few days ago, and you had this question, what I wrote down in my notes was, I avoid writing flute music out of fear.
That's totally fair.
Although I don't know if I don't know if that quite covers it as much as just I haven't received an opportunity where it's like, here's a person who's a really good flutist who, like, I now have the opportunity to write a piece for. Mm-hmm. And then in the case of myself, it's like, rather than writing out a whole flute piece for myself and having to figure out like ways to notate all of these techniques I'm talking about if I'm going to incorporate some of them, I like to just use that time to practice improvisation more. Mm-hmm. At least that's been more the vibe lately for me. Mm-hmm. Which is why you notice that I'm talking more about these extended techniques in like in improvisation context, which I think they've more been used in anyway. Like there are improvisers who do lots of head joint stuff, and I haven't heard as much of it in notated classical composition.
Yeah.
Yeah, so don't really have that satisfying an answer for you.
No, that's okay. It's really interesting that you say that. I never think of myself as like writing a lot of flute music because I don't know. I think there is a certain amount of like, well, I want to explore other things, and I'm also like I agree with the like, I don't know, I'm kind of afraid of the flute. In a weird way, as a composer, I like talk about thinking with my composer brain versus my performer brain. Mm-hmm. And then like I was just finishing up like just a catalog of all the works I've written, and I've written a lot of flute music, and it's like, I don't know, I feel like I have this weird relationship with my like, especially the flute music that I do write, where I can write it a lot easier because I can improvise. Like improvisation, I basically use it as a compositional tool at this point. I don't super perform it or anything, but I'll improvise and I'll say, yeah, I liked that. And then it's sort of a one-to-one translation because I'm playing on the flute. So I don't think about writing all these flute pieces because they're like a couple of days and then it's like, cool, done, move on to the next thing. And then I spend like a month researching clarinet extended techniques.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
I see how it could work that way.
Yeah. Also, this kind of goes back to extended techniques a little bit, but just out of curiosity, it popped into my head. Can you whistle?
No.
See, I have this theory that the muscles that you develop playing flute make it next to impossible to whistle, because I've never met another flute player who could whistle. And people write whistling
that's interesting.
in flute music. Quite a bit, like more than you would write it in other. I've played in a couple of wind ensemble pieces that asked the flutes to whistle. None of us could whistle. And I had a piccolo solo that I picked up in high school where you had to stick the piccolo in your ear and whistle the notes while you fingered them. And I couldn't play it. I thought this was the coolest piece
ever. Stick it in your ear?
Yeah, it was a really, I don't know, it was a really silly piece.
Very silly.
At the end, you got up so high that like the pianist was supposed to stand up and cover your ears for you. It was really... it was like a very much a performance art piece in addition to being a solo, and I really wanted to play it, but there was like 16 bars where I was just supposed to be whistling, and like it doesn't work. And there's absolutely no scientific basis to this theory. I've just never met another flutist who could whistle, so that's...
Well, I started learning flute when I was like 15 years old, and I could not whistle up until that point either.
Sure.
So I guess it's a little bit of a chicken egg thing.
Yeah, I do know at least one flutist who used to be able to whistle, picked up the flute, and then lost the ability. And I'm like...
Interesting.
That's just like...
It needs to be more research.
I guess don't write whistling in flute parts. Give it to some other woodwinds, even though the timbres aren't entirely disparate between the flute and like a whistle tone. No, don't. Your best bet is to give it to other people. In my very limited experience, I guess.
Yeah. I guess one other thing about like how flute impacts my composition or how it doesn't is that just part of the reason that in the past few years I've switched over to flute being my primary is because it just feels more useful. Like I was on a college campus where pianists were kind of a dime a dozen, and I'd grown up taking classical piano lessons for over 10 years. But I still just couldn't really hold a candle to a lot of the pianists who were like, actually doing the gigs around campus.
Sure.
Whereas like flutists, there were fewer of us, and so it didn't matter as much that I wasn't as good as some of the flutists, because in some situations it was like either me or no flutist for whoever was organizing the musical event. So then it became that like it became that like flute was something I was mainly doing for like playing other people's music and kind of enjoying that, right?
Yeah.
Enjoying like being a compositional bottom, I guess.
Yeah.
And we'll probably get into composition BDSM analogs in the equity discussion that we have, because I wanted to bring up Alex Temple's article on that, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
But that's for later on in the conversation, but
sure.
Just a little sneak peek.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. I always wanted to play flute, and I picked it up after like badgering my parents about it for years. But then I feel like in my like I was homeschooled, but I like went to play in high school bands, and I feel like there were so many flutes that like kind of like you were saying, I didn't really hold a candle to, and then I like worked really really hard so that I could like get into the top bands, and I was really lucky to have a great band program, and I really appreciate everything that got me. But I feel like I stayed with flute because there were so many people, and I was like, oh, but I want to play this cool music. I see everything that you're doing. Why can't I do that? So it's really interesting. But
right. So like you became a flutist to compete with other people, and I became a flutist to avoid competing with other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm over that now. I'm like, nah, I'm gonna do my own thing. Thank you for years of competition. I'll just be over here.
Goodbye toxicity.
Yeah. I'm gonna be a composer, and I'm gonna play for fun. Easy. So I know that like we have spoken about this quite a bit. I'm curious as to what are some of the biggest issues that you see in the classical field with equity and inclusion? Because it's something that I feel like I've learned a lot from like our conversations with my own musical practice.
Yeah. So I mean, just to preface this, I'm going to talk mainly about racial equity, just because that's what's kind of bouncing around in my mind the most the past few months. And when I actually give advice to people or speak from my own experience, I'm more speaking for an audience of white people, because like that is my own experience.
Right.
And like, I mean, I'm not about to give advice to people of color around like what to do or around equity. That's not my place to do that.
Definitely.
So just to make clear that that's what I'm saying, so that I'm not like giving advice with like a presumption of whiteness as universal in the audience, which can be an issue. So I think just main issues around equity and inclusion. Well, the main issue I see right now is like classical music being white supremacist. Yeah. And institutions being very reluctant to acknowledge that, even as they pay lip service to the idea of inclusion.
Yes.
So we really we have a collective history in classical music that still very much influences our values and priorities in the present day, that a lot of people just aren't really acknowledging. And it's a history around racism and nationalism, and the modern values of classical music, and the canon that we currently have in classical music being created to feed those essentially in the 1800s, and to justify colonialism, to justify European nationalism. And we're still stuck in, I guess, modes of analysis that like have that intellectual genealogy. And then obviously these systems are still controlled by mostly white people who are very reluctant to admit this, because we don't want to be told that something that we've invested so much in is has such harmful undertones, but it's something that we need to turn and face. Not just undertones, overtones. Right. And I guess instead, for instance, if you look at what steps orchestras and music departments have been taking in like the almost exactly a year since George Floyd's murder, is you see them being like, okay, we need to include more black people. We need to include more people of color. We need to program more composers of color, but we're just going to do like the first 5 that we think of, and not do more work to like find a wider variety of composers of color. And like the idea, so I'm sort of, since I'm on social media way too much, just kind of lurking, I see a lot of like, screenshots of tweets with interesting insights. And one that I just came across this morning was a black person writing and saying like the difference between diversity and inclusion and like liberation is that the latter like actually wants to see me free, and the former just like wants to get a good feeling from me being there.
Yeah.
So I think of that around, so I think of that around inclusion. Quoting another random social media post, when all you're talking about is inclusion and not like changing the culture or the attitudes of the predominantly white space that people of color are being brought into, or in other modes of analysis, the predominantly privileged space that more marginalized people are being brought into, then all you're doing is traumatizing marginalized people. And then making the space look good for grant applications, which is really just sort of an abuse of their existence. So that's the main issue I see in classical music right now.
I definitely get that. Like in my undergrad, they did a couple of like women's concerts or concerts from around the world.
God,
and it's
that.
like, no. And like they, even like with the posters that were designed, they were reliant heavily on stereotypes and made a big deal about, oh, this is like, we're so active, we're so activist, we're so forward looking. Look, we're programming so many Black composers this cycle. Look, see, and like, it really struck a wrong note with many of ensemble members, because it was so frustrating to see and then like have to take part of for a grade, like
and then the question there is like, well, who's the one making the programming decisions? Who decided that this was going to be the theme of your concert? Like, who actually has the power in this situation, or are you just being tokenizing?
And it was a I believe, from my view as a student, that it was a last-ditch attempt to be rehired for someone whose job was in question, and it was a sort of thinly veiled attempt to like, oh, I'm gonna do better. See, I'm great, and
Yikes.
It may not have been that. It may not have, but that's sort of the interpretation that I got as someone who was not involved in those decisions, but was just kind of a member of the ensemble watching it all play out. So it should be known that like I don't know exactly what the motivation was, but it did not feel even like a genuine effort to have inclusion, let alone like liberation. It was so with that in mind, how does this sort of work? How does activism inform your artistic practice? And how do the two interact in that way? I know it's a huge question, and
it's a huge question, and I have a whole long answer to it.
Sure.
The thing is that like when you sent me this episode outline, and then I was like making some notes for myself, I was like, oh no, I should not be doing this, because like I want this to be a two-way conversation with Alexa, right? And like just coming up with what I'm going to say beforehand, like that's not very organic. So I really should have gone more against type and just improvised for this. But like now I've spent 48 hours thinking about all the things I could say in response to it. But do feel free to jump in anytime, and we can let the conversation go wherever we like, because a lot of subjects came up in my mind when you suggested this question. So I'm going to try not to go into too much detail about like what my artistic practice has been in this, because I don't want to turn this into an advertisement for myself if it's a discussion about equity. But definitely one of my cats is I don't know if you can hear him. He's complaining.
Understandable. Cats are like that.
Because my dad went outside to mow the lawn, and whenever people are outside, it's just unbearable for him.
I understand.
So one of the main aspects of my artistic practice in like the past 4 years has been open scores, scores that don't use staff notation. You know, a lot of people will call it like Western notation or normal notation, but one of my professors in school was like, staff notation makes the most sense because there's other forms of notation, but they don't use the 5-line staff. And it's like, hey, that's cool. So yeah, a lot of my artistic practice in like the past 4 years has been around moving outside staff notation, moving outside fixed instrumentations, and doing things with text instructions and with more abstract graphics. And my relationship to that has kind of been a double-edged sword. Like, I mean, when I first started doing it, it was like, oh, this feels like it's very authentic, and that I'm doing something that like doesn't really conform to the value systems that I've been trained as a classical musician to like see as like, oh, this is what's good about music, which, like, as I mentioned, are white supremacist value systems.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, there was a certain amount of anxiety that came from like having classical training and all of the subconscious assumptions that come with that. That was making me almost want to escape classical music, to go into something else. And so then, you know, I'm doing things like in the vein of Paulina Oliveros, with like games for groups of people. And I'm finding that like I'm working with other classical musicians, and they're like, "Wow, you can do this," you know. And I get this feeling that it's almost like a savior complex, you know. Like I'm leading people out of classical assumptions, when like I don't have formal training in music that isn't classical. So like, who am I to do that? So I found that like there was a certain amount of anxiety or guilt around like being a classical musician that was leading me to want to do that as well. Like in addition to the positive thing of like, you know, I want to create interesting exploratory performance spaces and learn more about improvisation and all this.
I definitely feel that.
So there were two different things that really kind of changed or broadened my perspective on that. And they haven't made me like stop making open scores, but they've, like I said, changed my relationship to them, I guess. One of them is the article on New Music Box that Alex Temple wrote, Composers, Performers, and Consent, where she presents this idea that that a lot of people will assume. Well, here's another one of my cats Zoom bombing. A lot of people, like, you know, analyzing classical music from a critical lens, will assume that like any time hyper complex music is being written, like the performer is being objectified and like sort of, you know, reduced to a puppet. And Alex Temple presents the thing like, well, some composers who are specialists in that like that feeling. Like there's one performer in the Jack Quartet who maybe you've read this article.
I haven't read the article, actually. Okay. I'm really curious now to go and check it out.
Yeah, there's a performer in the Jack Quartet who likens it to BDSM.
Yeah.
He's like, you know, I'm a bottom in the environment of new music, and like I like the feeling of just like totally submitting myself to whatever the composer is wanting to do rather than like making my own artistic decisions. So like he enjoys being a puppet. Yeah. And Alex Temple says like, well, if some people enjoy that, then can you really say that they're always being objectified and exploited? Maybe it's more complicated than this. So she says the missing piece is consent. That like it becomes a harmful power dynamic when the composer just in an entitled way like assumes that assumes that they're entitled to full artistic
when the
control
composer becomes God.
Of whatever the performers are doing. And obviously that happens a lot. Like there's a lot of composers who are trained to think that they're God, that we're God. Yeah. I can definitely think of moments in my life where like I had that kind of entitlement that had just been trained into me. I'm going to try to cite examples of places where I've been harmful because I want to make sure that I'm not like presenting myself as someone who's perfect or who doesn't do harm. But like I've f***ed up in major ways in the past, and it's good to look back on that and see it. Yeah.
No, that's something that like especially I feel like every time that people play my music, I get and especially when I'm in the room, which I am for the most part, because there haven't been many performances of mine that have gone on without me, like, actively recruiting, you know. I get a very weird feeling of it. The closest description that I have is guilt, and I never really understood why until I kind of, I think that it's a discomfort with being in that position where some like I've never felt comfortable with this idea of the composer as God or being like presented or trained to be like the supreme leader of this, like the reason why these performers are here, and the reason why the conductor has something to do, and like you are the origin of the music. And I think that it's just a distinct discomfort. That's not grammatically correct, but what even is that? But it's like I get in that position and people are playing my music and I just want to be like, I'm sorry. And that's something that I've had to work really hard to overcome. But at the same time, like, I think it is a reaction to something that I don't want to be. Like, I don't, so it's a very weird, like, feeling.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So I think it was partially that discomfort which was driving me towards like more open scores, right? Mm-hmm. But the Alex Temple article made me realize that like maybe I've been going about this wrong. Maybe I need to, like, in addition to the open score work that I'm doing, turn back to like the classical environments that I've been trained in and be like, okay, how do we navigate this in a way that's more based in consent, that's more healthy, as opposed to just like, you know, burying it and avoiding it and running away from it? Because like I'm going to be put in that position anyway, whether I want to or not. Mm-hmm. And this brings me to another thing that changed my perspective on this somewhat, which is, so for the past several months, I just finished being in a group of people who were reading through Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, which is it's currently a bestseller on the New York Times list. So I guess this makes me like all mainstream to be recommending it, but it's a really amazing book. There's no other book quite like it. Mm-hmm. It looks at somatic practices and like how racialized trauma manifests in people's bodies, and like the path towards healing from that, and looks at he looks at like body-centered practices instead of like, you know, most racial justice books are more about like what is the political actions you can take. And he's like, well, if you're not grounded in like in bodily practice and in like healing your own trauma in a somatic way, then like your political activity isn't going to be sustainable. Yeah. So that's the nut graph of the book, just to let you know like what context this is from. Yeah, and
that feels very healthy, because like the burnout of like activism burnout or whatever is so real.
Yeah. No, this book is a great antidote to activism burnout, among many other things. Yeah. So My Grandmother's Hands. I think a lot of the things that I'm bringing up in this discussion are definitely influenced by it in some way, because it's kind of front of my mind. And one thing that Resmaa Menakem brings up is that there tends to be this dynamic among white progressives that like once we learn about our I guess the historical trauma of our ancestors from committing genocide or being an accessory to genocide, and like all the ways in which like the white privilege that we're afforded in society systemically harms other people, and all this, sort of the first response is like guilt and shame about it, including like being in environments where we ask people of color to comfort us, or we break down. I can think of times in my life where like I've been that white person, where like we break down and then the labor of people of color turns to be we force ourselves to be comforted, as opposed to all the emotional labor is then in service of us, as opposed to in service of like, you know, dismantling white supremacy. Right, exactly. And then there's this avoidance, this idea among white progressives that we need to diminish our whiteness if we're going to be like authentically activist. So like you notice like white people coming into POC activist spaces and then like using AAVE, trying to be all down and like not wanting to, and then like, you know, freezing or running if confronted about like, oh, you know, what is your relationship to your whiteness, right? Yeah. So and again, I'm using the we pronoun here because like I can think of situations where I've committed these types of harms. Basically, what Resmaa Menakem says in this particular part of the book is white progressives need to turn back to their whiteness in order to transform it into something different than the toxicity that it's always meant. Because like if they run away from it, then like they're still bringing the harm of whiteness with them, but they're just not acknowledging that harm, and then like kind of making it dirtier and making it worse by not doing that. So that brought me around to thinking about, like, again, these power dynamics in classical music, and like the idea that like, oh, I want to just, like, I've definitely had the thought like, oh, I want to just go away and be a jazz musician, right?
Yeah.
But there's so many things contained in that thought where, like, first of all, jazz training is something that takes as much of your life as classical training, and I don't have any of it. It's very entitled of me to think that I can just suddenly have that skill set when I can't, which comes from, like, you know, classical supremacy subconscious mindset, right?
Yeah, no, I very much, like, this is only tangentially related, but like in my senior year, I joined the vocal jazz group because I discovered that, oh my gosh, I love vocal jazz and this is very cool, and it was an amazing time. It only rehearsed twice a week versus the 4 times a week for double the length that our like classical choir was, and I was like, but why are we? Yeah, I don't know. And there was like one jazz professor in the whole school of music. And it was like,
Yep.
Yeah,
and then
and one ethnomusicology professor, and like you know how it is. To her credit, like she was very clear about like she was just a musicologist, but she taught the world music class and did not try and like an effort was very clearly made to do it in a productive way. And I think that for what it was, with the structure of the music program that like everything was operating under, both like the jazz groups that we had and the world music class that was had were done effectively as effectively as they could have been. But at the same time, it's a 1 semester elective against 6 semesters of music theory. That's just...
like non-classical music being an elective, whereas classical music is like core curriculum, isn't the fault of the people teaching the elective, and you'll definitely find the people teaching the elective who like are very brilliant and understand like what they're up against in the system they're working within. So not at all throwing collective shade at them. Yeah. But yeah, like these moments where I've been like, oh, I want to stop being a classical musician. It's like, well, then think about all the years that I've had classical training and all the assumptions I've been given about that. Am I just going to waltz into another space and then harm other people with those assumptions without realizing? Like, it's definitely like, it's not something that I'm not going to like, I mean, obviously being a classical musician is whiteness in this analog that I've set up, and that doesn't quite work because, like, 1, there's lots of non-white classical musicians. 2, being a musician in a particular genre is not the same thing as having a racialized body. Yeah. So definitely want to acknowledge all of that. But there's something to be said for turning inward and like examining our own assumptions, and then like how do we transform those in the environments that we're part of, as opposed to like as soon as we find something problematic around like our upbringing, around what we've been taught, we want to run away from that. And like at what point is that an abdication of responsibility? Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I think that that's a really productive viewpoint to have, and one that like I always really appreciate our conversations because it makes me a lot more introspective in the work that I'm doing, and like having a podcast where we're most of the way through the first season and I have not had any POC on. And is it due to filming schedules? A little bit, but is it also due to the fact that I have I've been training in this classical world that is predominantly white, and most of my friends within that sphere, most of my connections or my network or whatever you want to call it, most of them are not people of color. And those that are mostly not Black, and it's been something that I've been really working with, and not saying this to be like I'm doing my best, but like it is. No, I'm not getting that from you here at all. But it's something that I'm very conscious of, and something that I'm really happy to
have these sorts of conversations, because I think that they're very eye-opening to me in ways that I can really really seek to better the work that I am doing and the scope that I have with the background that I have and the privilege that I have.
Yeah. So I mean, you can say the same for me, that like most of my musician friends are white, and I guess part of what we've been talking about here is like, you can have this desire to be like, oh, I wanna leave this white space that is toxic in some ways because of how white a space it is, and like find a space that's less white. But like that's very voyeuristic,
right?
And also is, I mean, I just said the words abdication of responsibility, but I can say it again. Like if we have all these close connections, then we need to be doing the work in this space, rather than trying to find another space that like better suits the values that we just came up with.
Yeah.
Or not came up with, but values that that values that we just pivoted to being in alignment with. We didn't come up with these values. That was a poor word choice.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that, and I want to give you a huge thanks for coming on and joining us here at Classical Schmassical. If you at home enjoyed this episode, there is definitely more where that came from, so make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any further episodes. If you would like to continue the discussion on flute, equity and inclusion, artistic activism, or racism in the music world, especially as it's aimed towards white people in the music world, do join the Discord that is linked in the description, or visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/classicalschmassical, that's Schmassical, SCHMASSICAL. And remember, as always, stay classy and questionably classical.